So I'm Fabiano Ximenes. I'm a senior research scientist with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and I lead the Forest Carbon and Biomass group. Well, we look at the life cycle of carbon in forestry. So we study how carbon flows from when the forests are harvested through to when the timber is processed in sawmills, up until when the timber is used in houses, and all the way to landfills if products do end up in landfills. So we try to look at it from a life cycle perspective. So forests and sustainable management of forests is one of the tools that's widely acknowledged as a great way to combat climate change. So if you manage forests sustainably, it's quite an effective tool to sort of reduce carbon in the atmosphere. So what we do is try to understand for New South Wales where the opportunities are for the forest sector to contribute to that climate change impact, so that you can both have a productive forest but also have a great carbon outcome at the same time. We try to be as comprehensive as we can in the carbon accounting for the forestry. So when we do the accounting, we take into account not just the flows of carbon in the forest, but also what happens when you harvest the timber. How much carbon is physically stored in the timber, say your decking products, flooring, power poles, etc. They store carbon for a long period of time. So they are, in essence, a reservoir of carbon, right? And then when you produce timber products, you are most likely displacing other products that are more greenhouse intensive, which means that they require more energy in their production. So you can account for the benefit as well. And the other interesting element around forestry is that, as we know, there's a lot of residues that are produced both in the harvest and the processing stage of production. And there are really significant opportunities to use that residue in a climate smart way as well. So, and biochar is one example, right? So you can produce biochar, which is a product that sort of stores the carbon for a very long period of time if you put that back into the soil. And then that is in effect a carbon removal strategy. So the industry is helping, New South Wales achieve its targets. The other potential opportunities through the production of liquid biofuels. The transport sector is one of the hard to decarbonize sectors in Australia and globally, right? And they are looking for feedstocks everywhere. So by having the opportunity to use existing feedstocks from native forestry operations for the production of liquid biofuels, we are actually assisting those industries to decarbonize and also assisting New South Wales to achieve its emission reduction targets as well. One could argue that by harvesting the trees when they're harvested 50 or 60 years old or whatever, that you're transferring the carbon from the tree pool to a wood product pool, and therefore perhaps making that carbon pool more resilient. And then you're putting the carbon effectively in a bank of wood products, right? So, and if a bushfire came and wiped out the forest, so that all of that carbon would have been sort of gone back into the atmosphere. So it's almost like a security policy to say, well, if we're harvesting every so often, at least we're safeguarding some of the carbon, and we are letting those trees regrow and then starting the whole process again. The resources produced from our native forests cannot really be met easily by plantation forestry, right? So it's an understanding around what are the possible scenarios if we do stop native forestry, and I guess in a lot of cases the most likely scenario is that we end up using less timber and therefore more of the products that are more carbon intensive, which is not a great sort of outcome from a greenhouse perspective, or you can end up using logs from overseas or products from overseas, which in a lot of cases come from areas which are not managed the best way possible, so unsustainably managed. So, and if that leads to deforestation, that's a massive carbon pulse. And I come from, just from my personal background, I come from Brazil. I did forestry in Brazil, so I understand firsthand how forestry is done in different parts of the world. I would consider forestry, as it is managed in New South Wales, as being one of the top ranked countries in the world from a sustainable forest management. The science is pretty clear. So when you account for the carbon, when you take into account all the elements that you should account for from a life cycle assessment perspective, forests that are sustainably managed for production achieve better climate outcomes than forests managed for conservation alone. And that's not just us saying this. There are colleagues internationally with similar studies in Canada and other countries where they've achieved similar outcomes. And the IPCC itself, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in numerous reports that they've produced over the years, they acknowledge sustainable forestry management as one of the key tools to combat climate change.